In his recent press conference with French President Emmanuel Macron, President Joe Biden stated, "I'm prepared to speak with Mr. Putin if, in fact, there's an interest in him deciding he's looking for a way to end the war. He hasn't done that yet. If that's the case, in consultation with my French and my NATO friends, I'll be happy to sit down with Putin to see what he has in mind." President Vladimir Putin's spokesman replied that Russia is ready for negotiations and to ensure our interests. Now is the time for mediation based on the core interests and bargaining space of the three main parties to the conflict, Russia, Ukraine, and the United States. The war is devastating Ukraine. According to EU President Ursula von der Leyen, Ukraine has already lost 100,000 soldiers and 20,000 civilians. Not only Ukraine, but also Russia, the US, EU, and indeed the entire world stand to benefit enormously from an end to the conflict, lifting both the nuclear dread that hangs over the world today and the devastating economic fallout of the war. No less an authority than the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, has urged a negotiated political solution to the conflict, noting that Ukraine's chance for a military victory is not high.
Over the last several months, in fact, I would argue virtually from the 24th of February when the Russians first intervened, the tendency in the media has been to repeat ad nauseum whatever the Ukrainian government says and treat it as the truth. And let's be frank, from the outset, they've been telling everyone, well, the Ukrainians are winning, the Russians are losing. The Russians are losing tens of thousands of soldiers. They're losing hundreds of tanks and critical equipment, and the Russians can't do anything right, and the Russians are losing. Well, that has never really been true. Virtually from the beginning, the Russians went in with a fraction of the force that they had available because they assumed that we ultimately would negotiate and be interested in arranging a ceasefire and coming to some sort of agreement, because their principal interest, as you know, was always to have a neutral Ukraine. This didn't happen, and finally in the summer, I think the leadership in Moscow decided we've got to change our approach. We have no choice. We have to treat Ukraine as a theater of war, and that's what they've done. They have absolutely turned Ukraine into a theater of war, and they have changed their approach 180 degrees from what it was. The Ukrainians have been losing hundreds of thousands of men as casualties. We estimate they've had 400,000 casualties, of which over 100,000 are dead. Now, very recently, Ursula von der Leyen, who is the president of the European Union, actually admitted that the Ukrainians had lost at least 100,000 dead. The truth is that over the last several months, the losses have been so heavy that we think it's probably closer now to about 120 to 125,000. And the second part of this, of course, is that the Europeans, and we to a large extent, have run out of ammunition and equipment to send to them. We're now talking about building new equipment that could be sent over and stripping out whatever we can find from many of our own units, to the point where, frankly, if we had to fight a war in Central Europe, we'd be in trouble. We're down to days, maybe a couple of weeks of ammunition. The Russians have always been accused of running out of rockets, running out of missiles, running out of ammunition, and nothing could be further from the truth. They've been running out of tanks, and again, nothing could be further from the truth. The Russians now have set up a very effective defense while they build up for massive offensive operations in December and January. And those buildups are almost complete. We can account now, as I pointed out in the op-ed, for about 540,000 troops, 1,500 tanks, another 3,000 plus armored fighting vehicles, hundreds of guns, 1,000 rocket and drone strike systems, hundreds of fixed-wing aircraft, and hundreds of helicopters. The bottom line is that the Russians are now going to war, and the Ukrainians are, frankly, on the ropes. All of their sophisticated equipment, the rocket artillery systems, what few they have left, are operated now by Americans and British contractors. They don't have the trained personnel to do anything. So Ukraine is really in a lot of trouble, and that's why ZELENSKIY is working very, very hard to convince everybody that we should give our last full measure for Ukraine. But it's not going to work, and Ukraine is going to be destroyed. And as we've seen from the new missile strikes, the energy grid is almost completely gone. Electricity is almost totally absent. Water, food, all the amenities that make life bearable are missing. And millions of Ukrainians are now leaving Ukraine because they cannot live where they are. We should really be interested in easing the burden on the Ukrainians. And that burden will not be eased by supplying more arms that the Russians will simply destroy or capture. It will be eased by negotiations in which the West has to concede territory to Russia and agree to a non-NATO status, in other words, a neutral status for Ukraine. Nobody wants to do that, so under the circumstances, Ukraine is doomed. What's really depressing is that all of the things the Ukrainians have accused the Russians of doing are things the Ukrainians themselves have done. Ukrainian soldiers have actively posted video of Russian prisoners of war being executed. The Russians have not executed any prisoners of war. Quite the contrary. They've actually behaved remarkably well. And Putin has been absolutely insistent that they not kill civilians. The problem is that they were so careful in the past and so anxious to avoid damaged infrastructure that people thought they were weak. Well, that's now over. They are willing to accept collateral damage if they can destroy ammunition and storage points, fuel systems, and electricity. They will do that, and that's what's happening right now. And soon I think they'll move on to transportation infrastructure, bridges, roads, and these kinds of things to ensure that the Ukrainians cannot resupply themselves. And right now they're virtually at a standstill anyway. They have no diesel. They have no fuel. What fuel they have is going into generators to heat buildings and homes. So, everybody's pledging more and more and more, but the truth is, David, not much is arriving. There just isn't much to send anymore. So the real point is, if anybody cares about the Ukrainian people, if people want to see Ukraine as a nation state survive, we need to talk with the Russians, and no one seems to be willing to do that. General Milley's job is the senior advisor to the President of the United States. He has authority to reach out to anybody. That's one of the problems that General Milley has. He seems to think he's got authority that he doesn't. What he did is that he leaked to the New York Times comments that he made to President Biden. Incidentally, he leaked information that he had shared with President Trump when he was in office. He seems to do that in the hopes that this will somehow or another elevate his position. It's the wrong thing to do, but in the course of leaking to the New York Times, apparently he leaked this information because just as President Trump had rejected his advice on one or two occasions, you have the same thing happening now with President Biden. And when he suggested that the Ukrainians had done all that they could reasonably expected to do, and this was probably the right time to negotiate, he was told, forget it, out of the question. We're not negotiating with the Russians. And he didn't like it, and so he decided to leak it. Well, within 24 hours, he was obviously reprimanded, and he went public and recanted everything that he had said and talked again about fighting until the last Ukrainian is dead, and we have shipped the last round of ammunition. So, unfortunately, I think that's where we are, and when Biden or anybody else says, well, if the Russians want to end the war, we'll talk to them, what they're really saying is that if you capitulate, if you surrender to us on our terms, which is why I use the Carthaginian peace, then we'll talk to you. Well, that's absurd. Russia is not going to surrender to the West. That's nonsense. On the contrary, if we push this, the war will simply escalate, and it will find its way into Europe and to the United States. And that's the last thing we want. We need to understand that what's happened is that the United States and British intelligence agencies have created a false narrative. And the media in both of those countries, as well as the media in Western Europe, have been given instructions to repeat this narrative ad nauseum. And all of you have heard it. The Russians are losing. The Russians can't win. The Russians are incompetent. NATO will be victorious. The Ukrainians will win, and on and on and on. This is a big lie. This has been a lie from day one. And Ursula von der Leyen, quite, I guess, unconsciously spoke the truth. She didn't say 100,000 officers. She said 100,000 Ukrainian troops. And she said 20,000 civilians. Well, that may well be true, but now it's over 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers. It's closer to 120,000 Ukrainian soldiers plus probably 20,000 civilians. And we're going to see more civilian deaths because it's a war zone. And that war zone is not going to improve. It's going to become much more lethal. Instead of telling people the truth, which would obviously embarrass President Biden and all of his supporters on the Hill, as well as the current and previous British prime ministers and British Parliament, who all are posturing as moralizing globalists, trying to tell us all how bad and evil we are. As a result, they're not going to release the truth. So she's been told to shut up, back off, and do what she's told, just as General Milley was. But the truth is, what Milley said was accurate, and the truth is that what von der Leyen said was accurate. The Russians aren't losing. They've lost comparatively few troops compared to the Ukrainians. Their exchange rate right now is about 1 Russian for every 8 Ukrainian dead. That's not a good exchange rate if you're going to argue that you're winning the war. That's an exchange rate for someone who is definitely losing. Russia has not been harmed by sanctions. The people that have been harmed the most by sanctions are our allies in Europe and ourselves. I mean, stop and consider the plight of farmers in Europe and the United States and around the world who don't have access to fertilizer. The overwhelming majority of the fertilizer is supplied to the world by Russia and Belarus, and to a lesser extent, Ukraine. The same thing is true for wheat and a whole range of other products. The bottom line is that Russia has actually thrived. It's only the top 10 or 15% of the Russian population that is not getting some of the exquisite products that come out of Italy, France, and the United States. I'm talking about things like perfume or leather bags or some other thing, the things that are discretionary items, not things that you need to survive. But the Russian population as a whole, its standard of living is as good as it was when this began. And the Russians have adjusted, and they have found other markets for their fuel, for their energy, for their timber, for their minerals, for everything. So this whole thing from the beginning was a dumb idea because the underlying assumption was that we could somehow or another isolate Russia from the rest of the world. That's absurd. It was never possible. And the Russians clearly were not prepared for a major war, but now they are. And as a result, they're going to build forces in the future that are even more capable and more powerful than what we saw 30 or 40 years ago. And that's the cruelest aspect of this whole thing. The very thing that we said we were going to try to do, which was to weaken Russia by forcing it to fight in Ukraine at the expense of Ukraine, has failed. And what instead we are going to see is a much stronger and more capable Russia than existed at the beginning of this process. The Russians are going to complete the task of annihilating the Ukrainian armed forces, and I suspect they will destroy this government. I'd be very surprised if the Ukrainian leadership survives the next 2 or 3 months. And the outcome is going to be defeat. Defeat for Ukraine, and we and our partners in Europe are going to look ridiculous. Now, there is one possibility, and that is that the Europeans, particularly the Germans, wake up to reality, figure out that they've been lied to about everything, and they suddenly say, that's it, we've had it, we're out. And when that happens, or if that happens, the whole thing collapses in the West. But right now, we're just on the path to certain defeat. And no one wants to admit that. And so the argument is, well, we won't be defeated. We'll just keep sending in more equipment, sending in more cash, try to find more mercenaries that'll go over there and man equipment and fight for the Ukrainians. I don't see that as a winning proposition. I think time is on Russia's side, not on ours. And the Russians live there, we don't. The real issue here is that Americans have got to start paying attention to reality. We have no business in involving ourselves in wars 5,000 or 6,000 miles from our country. Certainly not unless there is something at stake for us. And in this case, there's nothing at stake for us. The only real interest we ever had was in peace. And what we're having and what we're dealing with right now is war that we didn't want and didn't need. It's harming everyone. Once the Soviet Union and the supporting Warsaw Pact system all collapsed and fell apart, that was the beginning of the end of the post-World War order. Now what's happened is that since we clung tenaciously to the past and refused to let anything go, we've been trying for the last 30 years to effectively freeze the international system in a way that we see as beneficial to us. Well, it may be beneficial to us in some ways, but it's not beneficial to the rest of the world. The Russians are simply the first ones to stand up and say, that's enough. No more. We're not prepared to be exploited by you financially. We're not prepared to turn our country over to you to be dismembered and destroyed. And we've watched what you've done in other countries. We're not going to let you do that to us. And by the way, the Chinese, the Indians, and dozens of other countries on the planet have reached the same conclusion, which is why when you look at this war, the only people that have been interested in supporting us at all are really our allies in Western Europe and some in Eastern Europe, but not everybody. And you begin to see that the vast majority of countries are either disinterested or actively support Russia. Zelensky has made a terrible mistake by trying to pin the missile strikes on Russia. Everyone knows that the Russians had nothing to do with it, and what he's done is sacrifice what little credibility he has left. Increasingly, he's viewed, especially in Europe, where more and more truth is getting through to the populations, he's seen as the mayor of the capital of disinformation and fiction. The truth is that the situation Ukraine finds itself in right now is really quite desperate. The Russians have systematically dismantled most of the energy system. People are lacking in terms of heat, and the lack of heat is not the only problem when you destroy the energy grid. It also has implications for the availability of water and transportation and food and so forth. Bottom line is Ukraine is being prepared for a massive offensive launched by the Russians sometime over the next week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, once the ground is thoroughly frozen. And that buildup right now has reached about 540,000 Russian troops, over 300,000 in the south, a little over 200,000 in the north, with 1,000 rocket artillery systems, 5,000 armored fighting vehicles, including at least 1,500 tanks, huge quantities of artillery, tactical ballistic missiles. All of these things have been readied for a massive assault that is designed ultimately to end the war. And tragically, we keep insisting that the Ukrainians not negotiate, that they talk about it but do nothing. And this really consigns Ukraine and its population to more suffering and certain defeat. I think General Milley is aware of what I just described. He knows about the Russian military buildup. He knows the true state of the Ukrainian armed forces, which is miserable. And he did something that he's done before. He has a bad habit of leaking his private advice to the president, to the press. He did that to Trump, and he's done it now to Biden. And what he leaked was true, although that doesn't say much for him because he hasn't been very truthful to this point, but I think he's afraid. I think he's afraid that we might consider intervening somehow or another in Ukraine as Ukraine is finally and completely defeated. So I think he said the following. He said, look, the Ukrainians have done about all they can reasonably do. We shouldn't expect them to do more than they have. And secondly, this is a good time to negotiate. Actually speaking, it's not. There are no more good times to negotiate because the Russians hold all of the cards and the Ukrainians hold nothing. The best the Ukrainians can hope for at this point is a ceasefire, and then they'll have to agree to cede large quantities of territory and end this war, because if they don't, they're going to be utterly and completely destroyed. And I think Billy knows that. So he leaked that to the New York Times because it was made clear to him by the president's advisors, the Secretary of State, virtually everyone on the civilian side of the equation said, absolutely not, we will not negotiate. And I think the reason for that is very obvious. They do not want to admit that they were wrong, that they should have stopped this war months ago before it got started. They don't want to admit that they have been lying to the American people repeatedly about the true state of affairs on the ground in Ukraine. But Billy is afraid that he might be asked to do something, that the forces we have on the ground in Poland might be asked to do something. He doesn't want to do it, and for good reason. We're in no position to go to war with Russia, and anything that we might do on the ground would fail miserably, and we'd be embarrassed. But obviously no one is listening. And when I say no one, I mean no one in Washington. You have some Republicans, some conservatives who've raised issues about the money. But even there's no real understanding of just how desperate the situation is in Western Ukraine. So what we can look forward to, in addition to this massive offensive, is the migration of several million more Ukrainians to the West because they have nowhere else to go. The military headquarters and most of the remaining power that exists is all being channeled to the far western part of Ukraine towards Lvov, which sits just about 20 miles from the Polish border. So Ukrainians know what's coming. There's not much they can do about it at this point. But instead of throwing them a lifeline, we've essentially told them to sink with the ship that they're on. Because remember, we ship over equipment, but most of the dollars don't go to Ukraine. They are just simply laundered through the process and end up in the pockets of donors. And the donors, when they're happy, end up subsidizing the members of the Senate and the House who support the bad policies they advocate. So this is a sort of self-licking ice cream cone. At the same time, we have no idea what happens to much of the equipment. Some of it is used. Some of it is resold. We are, of course, subsidizing what remains of the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian government. They're effectively now a dependent of the United States and American largesse. All of these people will benefit. Ukraine will be destroyed. Ultimately, what will emerge from all of this is probably a rump Ukraine with everything south to the Black Sea and to the east of the Dnieper River under permanent Russian control. And that rump Ukraine will be left to die on the vine as some sort of neutral territory, and no one will mention it again once it happens. I mean, what do we do whenever we go somewhere and we fail miserably and we leave? We stop talking about it. We stopped talking about Vietnam after we left. We've stopped talking about Iraq and Afghanistan. We've never really talked about Libya. So wherever we go and we fail, we just stop talking and people move on to the next cash cow. Well, the armchair generals and warmongers lose interest once there's no more money in it, and they all want to cover up the failure. The danger, of course, with Ukraine is very different. I mean, right now, we could use all of those troops on the southern border. We could be saving hundreds of thousands of lives across the country by stopping the movement of the fentanyl and other illicit drugs, by stopping the human trafficking. You know, we're seeing billions of young men migrate into the United States from Latin America and other places. We know nothing about them. We don't know where they're going to end up. But these are hardly refugees in the sense that we normally think of it. So the attempt in Washington seems to be, on the one hand, to destroy everything in the United States and to try and save this, Ukrainian construct, which frankly is about to go out of existence. I'm beginning to think that Biden and his friends have the sort of reverse Midas touch. Everything they touch turns to garbage. Well, I think this administration has very little room to maneuver. It either supports this or it doesn't. If it doesn't, then we'll witness a nuclear arms race that nobody really wants, and all of us can't afford it. So my hope is that something positive will come out of these talks. But in the meantime, I don't know how much worse it can get economically. You have many countries overseas that are dumping U.S. treasuries. Our position here at home continues to weaken. And having brought in billions more of illegals, one wonders how, in the event that we continue into this deep recession or worse, how we can afford to maintain all of these people inside our borders who are not citizens. It's a bad situation. but no one seems to be concerned about it until it gets to the point where everything implodes. So I think we're coming to that point. I hope it's not as bad as Sri Lanka, but I think we're on a very dangerous road. And this administration has no good answers except to double down on existing policies, all of which are failures.